There's a moment in every man's life when he realizes he's been made a fool. It's not always dramatic. Not like in movies where some poor guy walks in on his wife tangled in the sheets with another man, or where he finds a lipstick-stained collar like it's 1952. No, real life is much sneakier than that. Real betrayal doesn't slap you across the face. It seeps in, slow and steady, until you wake up one day and wonder how long you've been blind. My name is Richard Mercer, and until very recently, I thought I had a perfectly normal life. Dorothy and I had been married for 12 years, and I had what most people would call the good life. The kind of life where you have a joint savings account, a king-sized bed, and a set of steak knives from your wedding registry that are still in pristine condition because you never actually cook. A predictable life, a stable life, and, apparently, a life that was completely fake. It all started on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays are the worst possible day for anything eventful to happen. Monday at least has the excuse of being the beginning of the week, and Wednesday has that midweek crisis energy. But Tuesday? Tuesday is just useless. The fact that my world began to fall apart on a Tuesday somehow made it worse. I was at work, halfway through eating an overpriced salad that tasted like regret, when I got an email from my accountant. Now, this was already strange, because I hadn't spoken to my accountant since tax season, and I like to keep it that way. But the subject line was what really caught my eye. Urgent. Address confirmation? Now, I don't consider myself a paranoid man, but I also know that urgent and accountant should never be in the same sentence. I clicked on it, chewing the sad excuse for lettuce as I read. Richard, just wanted to confirm. Are you and Dorothy moving? I received an address change request this morning for all joint accounts and financial documents. Just double-checking before I process it. I reread the email 3 times before my brain fully processed it. Address change? Moving? Joint accounts? Now, unless Dorothy had suddenly developed a rare form of sleep relocation disorder, there was only one logical conclusion. My loving wife had apparently decided to pack up and go somewhere else, and failed to mention this tiny detail to me. Naturally, my first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe it was some administrative error, some bank mix-up. So, I did what any reasonable husband would do. I called my wife. She didn't answer. Okay, no need to panic. It's just one missed call. Maybe she was in a meeting, maybe her phone was on silent. So I called again, and then once more, just for good measure. Still nothing. At this point, I was trying to remain calm, but my brain was starting to piece together a rather disturbing picture. If Dorothy had requested an address change, it meant she was planning to receive documents somewhere else. And if she was receiving documents somewhere else, it meant she had somewhere else to be. And if she had somewhere else to be, well, that was a problem. So, instead of going back to pretending my salad had any nutritional value, I forwarded the email to myself and left work early. Because when your wife is secretly moving out of your house without telling you, spreadsheets can wait. When I got home, the first thing I did was check the closet. It was a stupid move, but in the moment, I half expected to find her side empty, like some dramatic scene from a soap opera. But no, her clothes were all there. Her shoes were all lined up in neat little rows. Her jackets still hung in their usual spot. That was almost more unsettling, because this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. She hadn't packed a bag and fled in the night. No, she was still coming home, still living here, still pretending that everything was normal while, behind the scenes, she was making plans for a life that no longer included me. And that's when the real fun began. I opened my laptop, logged into our joint bank account, and immediately felt my stomach drop. Dorothy, my lovely and apparently extremely ambitious wife, had been transferring money out of our account for weeks. Not all at once. She was too smart for that. Small amounts. Just enough to avoid raising any red flags. But the total was significant. Very significant. I clicked on one of the transactions, tracing the destination of the funds. And that's when I saw it. The name on the receiving end wasn't a person. It was a company. A moving company. Oh, this was so much worse than I thought. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Dorothy wasn't just thinking about leaving. She was actively preparing for it. Secretly moving money, changing addresses, setting up some kind of escape plan right under my nose. And yet, every night, she came home, ate dinner with me, slept in our bed, looked me in the eyes, and kissed me goodbye in the mornings. That kind of deception doesn't happen overnight. No, that takes practice. That takes experience. And suddenly, a much darker question crept into my mind. How long had she been lying to me? Because if she was capable of hiding something this massive, what else was she capable of? At that moment, my phone buzzed. A text from Dorothy. Sorry, hon. Just saw your calls. Busy day at work. What's up? I stared at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Oh, Dorothy. You have no idea what's up. That was the moment I realized that my wife, the woman I trusted, the woman I built a life with, had secrets. Big ones. And I was going to find out every last one of them, even if it destroyed everything in the process. Dorothy came home at 7:15, right on time. Like clockwork. She had this routine, perfected over the years, where she'd walk in, drop her purse on the kitchen counter, kick off her shoes, and sigh like she'd just returned from a 12-hour shift in a coal mine. The kind of sigh that made me feel guilty for existing comfortably in my own home. Oh, what a day, she groaned, rubbing her temples for added effect. I swear, if one more person at work asks me to, I wouldn't know what she was about to say because I wasn't listening. I was too busy watching her. Not just watching, studying. Every move, every pause. She had no idea that, as of this morning, I was no longer Richard Mercer, loving husband. No, I had been promoted to Richard Mercer, private investigator of my own marriage. A title I neither asked for nor wanted. But here we were. Oh yeah, I said, pretending to be interested. Sounds exhausting. She kept talking. I have no clue what about. I was busy mentally listing all the ways I could subtly get more information out of her without setting off any alarms. The address change. The moving company. The disappearing money. It was all sitting there, waiting for me to drop a single question that could either blow the whole thing open or make her more careful. But before I could decide on my approach, she did something unexpected. She walked over and kissed me on the cheek. It was a simple gesture, but one that, under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have thought twice about. Except now, every single thing she did felt like evidence. Because why would a woman who was secretly moving out kiss her husband hello? It was either guilt, habit, or, most terrifyingly, because she still thought she was getting away with it. I played it cool, sat down on the couch, watched her as she moved around the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water. So, I said casually, what's new? She shrugged. Not much. The usual. Ah, the usual. Classic Dorothy. The same Dorothy who, as of this morning, was orchestrating a full-blown relocation operation behind my back. I stared at her, half expecting to see some kind of giveaway. Some twitch, some nervous glance. But no. She was good. Too good. Then she did something even stranger. She went into the hallway closet, rummaged around, and came back holding something I hadn't seen in years. Our wedding album. She plopped down beside me and flipped it open, all smiles. Look at us, she said, pointing to one of the photos. God, we were so young. What? What was happening? Why was my wife, who was clearly planning to leave, reminiscing about our wedding like we were some adorable old couple on a nostalgic trip? I nodded along, keeping my tone neutral. Yep, young and naive. She laughed. Oh, come on. We weren't that bad. She turned another page, staring at a picture of us cutting the cake. You know, sometimes I miss those early years. Now, I was absolutely losing my mind, because this was not the behavior of a woman who was plotting an escape. This was the behavior of someone who, if I didn't know better, seemed like they were perfectly happy. And that's when it hit me. She wasn't planning to leave me. She was planning something else. Something bigger. Something worse. I just didn't know what. So, I kept playing along. Yeah, I said, pretending to get all sentimental. Good times. She smiled, closing the album. We should do something special soon. Just the two of us. My internal alarms were going off at full volume. I needed to figure out what was going on, fast. That's when I remembered the one place she never let me touch. The upstairs storage box. Dorothy's personal mystery vault. She had this old, ugly wooden box she kept in the guest room closet. It had been there since before we got married. I always assumed it had sentimental stuff. Old letters, childhood memories, whatever. But tonight, I was opening it. At exactly 2:30 a.m., when Dorothy was sound asleep, I got out of bed. I moved quickly, quietly. Years of late-night fridge raids had prepared me for this moment. When I reached the guest room closet, I hesitated for only a second before pulling the box out and placing it on the floor. Then, with the precision of a man who has officially abandoned all moral high ground, I picked the lock with a paperclip. Yes, I watched a tutorial. No, I will not be ashamed of my resourcefulness. The lid creaked open. Inside, I expected old letters. Maybe some embarrassing high school memorabilia. Instead, I found two things. One was an envelope, a legal document. I barely had time to process it before my eyes landed on the second item, a brand new set of house keys. But not our house. I just sat there, staring at them. House keys. A document. Dorothy's sudden interest in wedding nostalgia. And that's when the puzzle came together. She wasn't moving out. She wasn't leaving me. She was replacing me. Because the document, the legal document, it wasn't for a house purchase. It was a marriage certificate application. And Dorothy was about to become Mrs. Dorothy somebody else. I carefully placed everything back the way I found it and returned to bed. When I slipped under the covers, I turned to look at her. She was sleeping peacefully. Not a single hint of worry on her face. Of course not. Because in her mind, everything was under control. She had the money. She had the new home. She had the marriage application. And she had no idea that I knew. I closed my eyes, pretending to sleep. But inside, I was wide awake. Because now, the game had really begun. The first thing I did the next morning was pretend nothing had changed. I got up, took a shower, got dressed, and made coffee like I wasn't living with a woman who had filed a marriage application behind my back. Dorothy came downstairs all smiles, kissed me on the cheek, and grabbed her phone, probably texting her new fiancé. "You seem extra cheerful today," I said, sipping my coffee. She looked up from her screen. "Just in a good mood." I bet. I wanted to throw the marriage application at her face and ask if she preferred a spring or summer wedding, but that would ruin the fun. No, I wanted answers. And Dorothy had unknowingly handed me my first lead. The keys. They weren't labeled, so I had no idea where they belonged. But a key isn't just a piece of metal, it's an invitation. Someone out there had given my wife a new home, and I was going to find it. The problem? I had 0 leads. No address. No clues. Just a pair of mystery keys and a rapidly increasing desire to burn my entire marriage to the ground. Then, like divine intervention, Dorothy made a mistake. She grabbed her purse and walked toward the door, then paused. "Oh, I almost forgot." She hurried back, opening the kitchen drawer and pulling out her spare keys. I stared at them. "Oh, Dorothy, you don't even realize what you just did." Because now I knew. The mystery keys weren't hers, which meant they belonged to him. She left, humming a song like she wasn't in the middle of a full-blown double life. I pulled out my phone, opened Google, and typed, "How to track where a key belongs." The internet, being its usual unhelpful self, suggested that I try the key in different locks. Fantastic. That narrowed it down to every house in the city. I needed a new approach. And as much as I hated to admit it, I needed help. That's where Greg came in. Greg had been my best friend since college. He was the kind of guy who could find anyone, anywhere, at any time. Not because he was a genius. No, Greg was just really good at being nosy. His last job involved tracking down missing contractors for a construction firm, which meant he had access to databases that normal people shouldn't. I called him. "Richie," he answered. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I got straight to the point. "I need you to run an address check." Silence. Then, you planning a surprise move, or are we talking something darker? I hesitated. Hypothetically, if someone had a set of house keys and needed to know where they belonged, how would one go about that? Greg laughed. "You steal a man's wallet too, or just his dignity?" "I'm serious." "I know. That's why I'm laughing." I exhaled. "Greg, do you have a way to check addresses?" There was a pause. "If I say yes, Will you tell me what the hell is going on? No. Fine. Text me a picture of the keys. I sent him the photo. Greg, being Greg, texted back almost immediately. Bro, they're literally from a new building complex. See the logo? That's Redwood Heights. I squinted at the image. The keychain had a tiny engraving, RH. Redwood Heights. A luxury apartment complex on the other side of town. So, Dorothy's future husband lived in a fancy new apartment. That narrowed it down. I called Greg back. Can you check recent lease agreements at Redwood Heights? You realize this is wildly illegal, right? So is stealing a marriage certificate while you're still married. But here we are. Greg sighed. Fine. Give me an hour. 58 minutes later, Greg called back. Well, he said, sounding way too excited. Turns out, a certain Mrs. Mercer recently co-signed a lease. I gripped my phone. She what? Oh yeah, you're gonna love this. Dorothy Mercer is listed as a secondary leaseholder on Unit 512 at Redwood Heights. Primary leaseholder? A Mr. Edward Langley. Edward Langley. I didn't know an Edward Langley. Which meant Dorothy had officially left the cheating with an ex zone and entered the I found a brand new husband zone. Greg was still talking. Lease started 3 months ago. Payments are automatic, from a bank account that isn't yours. She has another bank account? Clearly. And it's funding her new home. I ran a hand through my hair. 3 months. Dorothy had been living 2 lives for 3 whole months, and I hadn't even noticed. Greg chuckled. Dude, you sound shockingly calm for a guy who just found out his wife is financing a new life with a man you've never met. I was anything but calm, because I had a new mission now. I was going to meet Edward Langley. The next evening, I drove to Redwood Heights. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't about to knock on the door and introduce myself as, hello, I'm the husband of the woman you're engaged to. Mind if I come in? No, I needed information. So, I waited. At exactly 6:45 p.m., I saw Dorothy, leaving Unit 512. She looked different. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way someone looks when they're comfortable, relaxed, happy. She wasn't faking anything here. This was real for her. She got into her car and drove off, probably heading back to me, her official husband, which meant Edward was still inside. I walked up to the building entrance and buzzed a random number. Hello? Hey, it's maintenance. Someone reported a water issue. The door clicked open. Don't ask how I knew that trick. Just accept that I've lived in a lot of apartments. I took the elevator to the 5th floor. Unit 512. I knocked. Seconds later, Edward Langley opened the door. And I realized, in that instant, that I had been wrong about everything. Because Edward Langley wasn't some new fiancé. Edward Langley was 60 years old. Edward Langley had gray hair and reading glasses. Edward Langley was Dorothy's father. I just stood there. He frowned. Can I help you? I opened my mouth, then closed it. Dorothy wasn't leaving me for another man. She wasn't secretly engaged. No, she was hiding her father. A father she had told me was dead. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just an affair. Dorothy was running an entire second life. Edward Langley, the man my wife had declared dead years ago, was standing in front of me in a sweater vest and slippers, blinking like I was a very unexpected problem. He said, which, frankly, was not the level of explanation I was looking for. My brain was working overtime trying to process this. Dorothy hadn't just lied. She had erased a whole human being. And not just any human being. Her father. This wasn't normal infidelity. This wasn't a whoops, I fell onto another man's situation. This was something bigger. Richard, right? Edward finally said. His voice was calm, but there was something just beneath it. Hesitation. So, he knew who I was. Which meant Dorothy had told him about me. The question was, what exactly had she told him? You recognize me, I said, keeping my voice steady. That's interesting. Because according to my wife, you're supposed to be 6 feet underground. Edward exhaled through his nose, then glanced down the hallway like he was checking for witnesses. Suspicious behavior, if you ask me. Look, he said, lowering his voice. I don't think we should be having this conversation here. See, that's funny, I said, folding my arms. Because I think we should. He hesitated. Good. That meant he had something to hide. And I was about to find out exactly what it was. Richard, he said carefully, this isn't what you think. Oh. I raised an eyebrow. Because I think my wife has been secretly funneling money into a second household, one where she lives with a man who is not me. That seems pretty self-explanatory. Edward sighed. It's complicated. Oh, excellent. I love complicated. Please, enlighten me. He hesitated. Then, finally, he stepped aside. Come in. I did. And that's when things got even worse. Because sitting inside his apartment, looking just as uncomfortable as Edward, was another man. And that man was wearing a wedding ring. The moment he saw me, his face drained of color. I turned to Edward. I don't suppose you'd like to introduce me to your roommate? The guy swallowed hard. His hands were clasped together like he was praying I wasn't real. Edward ran a hand through his thinning hair. Richard, meet? Herbert, the guy cut in. Herbert Collins. I stared at him. Herbert Collins. I didn't know a Herbert Collins. But judging by the sheer level of panic in his eyes, he sure as hell knew who I was. I slowly turned back to Edward. And Herbert here is? Edward looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Herbert, however, decided to answer. I'm Dorothy's husband, he said. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't have anything to say. Oh, I had plenty to say. But because my brain had decided to shut down for a solid 5 seconds, just to protect me from a stroke. When I finally managed to regain control of my limbs, I turned back to Edward. So, I said, very, very carefully, what I'm hearing is, Dorothy isn't just leading a double life. Edward closed his eyes. She's leading a double marriage. Herbert cleared his throat. I turned to him. How long? His mouth opened and closed. What? I stepped forward. How long? He swallowed. 10 years. I almost laughed. Because of course it was 10 years. Not 6 months, not 2 years. No, a full decade. That meant Dorothy had been married to both of us the entire time. While I was buying her anniversary gifts, so was Herbert. While I thought she was visiting family, she was with Herbert. While I was out here being a perfectly average husband, she had another one. You didn't know, Herbert said weakly. I stared at him. Are you telling me you did? He exhaled. Not at first. Not at first. So, at some point, he had found out, and he stayed. You knew she was married to me, I said. My voice was disturbingly calm. And instead of, I don't know, alerting me to the fact that my wife is a part-time bigamist, you just went along with it? He rubbed his temples. It's not that simple. Oh, please. I'm dying to hear how being married to 2 men at the same time is complicated. Edward stepped in. Richard, I know this looks bad. This is bad, Edward. I gestured around. There is no positive version of this situation where my wife has a bonus husband. Edward sighed. Look, just sit down. Let's talk. Talk. Talk about what, exactly? How Dorothy had managed 2 entire marriages like she was running a timeshare. How she had built 2 lives, 2 bank accounts, 2 sets of anniversaries. I turned back to Herbert. Did you 2 ever talk about what would happen if I found out? Herbert exhaled. Yes. And she said she'd handle it. I let out a laugh that sounded wildly unstable. Oh, I bet she did. Because of course she had a plan. Dorothy had been 10 steps ahead this entire time. I just had one last question. I turned back to Edward. You knew, didn't you? He looked at the floor. You knew she was married to 2 men? Silence. I nodded slowly. That was it, then. All of them had been in on it. Edward, Herbert, Dorothy, and I was the moron. For 10 whole years. I walked to the door. Herbert stood. Wait, Richard, don't. I turned back. Oh, don't worry. I'm not going to do anything dramatic. I smiled. But Dorothy is in for one hell of a surprise when she gets home. Dorothy came home at exactly 7:12 p.m. She had always been good at time management. After all, juggling 2 marriages required a strict schedule. She walked in, smiled, and tossed her purse onto the counter like she hadn't been busy committing actual bigamy for the past decade. Hey, honey, she said casually, taking off her coat. How was your day? I smiled back. Oh, you know, met your other husband. It was beautiful. Watching the sweat drain from her face like someone had just hit the emergency evacuation button on her sweat system. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. So, would you like to start with an apology or an explanation? Her hands trembled slightly as she set her coat down. Richard, I held up a finger. Actually, hold that thought. I have a presentation. She blinked. What? I walked over to the TV, grabbed the remote, and turned it on. The screen lit up with a PowerPoint slideshow titled, How to Lose 2 Husbands in 10 Minutes. Dorothy made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a dying squirrel. What is this? I clicked to the first slide. It was a photo of Herbert Collins. You remember Herbert, right? I said, glancing at her. Your other husband. The guy you've been legally married to for 10 years. You know, since I'm not enough for you. Dorothy's breathing got shallower. Richard, I can explain. I clicked to the next slide. It was a screenshot of the marriage certificates. Both of them, side by side. She visibly swallowed. Where did you get those? Oh, Dorothy. I shook my head. The real question is, where did you get them? I mean, how does a woman accidentally end up with 2 legal husbands? Did you just wake up one day and think, I could really go for another spouse? She opened her mouth, closed it. I clicked again. The next slide was a timeline of her 2 marriages, complete with color coding. Her eyes darted across the screen, scanning the overlapping anniversaries, vacations, and holidays. You really should have staggered the wedding dates, I mused. I mean, celebrating 2 anniversaries in the same month? That's just sloppy planning. She gripped the counter. I was going to tell you. Oh, you were? I feigned surprise. How generous of you. When exactly were you planning to mention that you had an extra husband lying around? Before or after you added a third? She clenched her jaw. This isn't funny. I stared at her. Oh, it's hilarious. Click. The next slide was a screenshot of the bank transactions. The secret account. The rent payments to Redwood Heights. Dorothy actually winced. Oops, I said mockingly. Guess you should have been more careful when funneling money out of our account. Pro tip, financial crimes are harder to hide when you're using shared funds. Her hands balled into fists. I can fix this. I grinned. Oh, you really think so? Click. The final slide. It was a video. A security cam recording of Dorothy leaving Herbert's apartment at 6:45 p.m. Exactly 27 minutes ago. Her face collapsed. She knew what that meant. She had just left Herbert's, telling him some made-up story about where she was going. And now, here she was, at her other home, with me. I folded my arms. You didn't even change your shoes. That's how sloppy you've gotten. Dorothy stood frozen, trapped in her own disaster. I let the silence stretch. I wanted her to really feel it. And then, with perfect timing, my phone rang. I pulled it out, checked the screen, put it on speaker. Herbert's voice came through. Richard? It's Herbert. We need to talk about Dorothy. Dorothy closed her eyes. I smiled at her. Oh, don't worry, Herbert, I said, never breaking eye contact with her. We're already talking. Dorothy stood there, pale as a ghost, while Herbert's voice crackled through the speakerphone. Richard, I don't even know how to say this, but I just found out something huge. I raised an eyebrow, glancing at Dorothy. Oh, you don't say? Something huge? Well, Herbert, I am on the edge of my seat. Please, do share. Dorothy looked like she was either going to pass out or spontaneously combust. I was rooting for the latter. Dorothy, she's been lying to both of us, Herbert continued, his voice unsteady. I went through her things. Richard, she's not just married to us. I stared at the phone, then at Dorothy, then back at the phone. I let the silence stretch, just to let that bomb detonate properly. Herbert, I said slowly, savoring every syllable. Are you telling me that our dear wife is running more than just a 2-husband operation? Herbert swallowed hard. Richard, there's a third. Dorothy finally snapped. You went through my stuff? I let out a low whistle. Wow, Dorothy. That's your main concern right now? Not the fact that you've somehow managed to acquire an entire trilogy of husbands. She looked at me, then at the phone, then back at me, like a malfunctioning robot desperately searching for an escape route. Who's the third? I asked, because at this point, I had embraced the complete collapse of my reality. Herbert sighed. Some guy named Matthew Garrison. I found his marriage certificate, same date as mine, different state. My head tilted. So let me get this straight. Dorothy here has been simultaneously married to 3 different men, in 3 different places, for a full decade. Herbert exhaled. Looks that way. I looked at Dorothy, truly impressed. You know, I was mad when I thought it was just me and Herbert. But this is a masterpiece of fraud. She had nothing to say. Probably because there was literally no defense for this. I tapped the phone. Herbert, buddy, listen. I think it's time we take a different approach. He hesitated. What do you mean? Oh, I grinned. How would you like to team up? Dorothy immediately found her voice. Richard, don't. Dorothy, sweetheart. I held up a hand. You are in no position to give instructions. Herbert sounded skeptical. Team up how? Well, Herbert, my dear co-husband, I don't know about you, but I'm not in the mood to handle this quietly. And since Dorothy has made a career out of double-booking her wedding vows, I say we make sure she gets the proper recognition she deserves. Herbert paused. Are you suggesting we? Oh, absolutely. We're going public. Dorothy's eyes tripled in size. Richard, please. I smiled. No, you please. Please explain to your 3 husbands why they shouldn't turn this into the biggest scandal of the decade. She had nothing. Herbert let out a low chuckle. You know what? I'm in. I clapped my hands together. Fantastic. Dorothy reached for me, her voice cracking. Richard, I know you're upset. Oh, upset? I laughed. No, Dorothy, upset was 10 hours ago. Right now, I am thriving. Because in about 30 minutes, the world is going to know that you, Dorothy Mercer, have been running a full-time marital Ponzi scheme. Her face was pure terror. You can't do this. I tilted my head. Can't I? She actually had the nerve to grab my arm. Please, Richard, think about this. If you do this, I'll lose everything. I stared at her hand, then at her face, and grinned. Dorothy, I said, voice dripping with satisfaction. That's exactly the point. The next morning, Dorothy Mercer's entire life exploded. Herbert and I wasted no time. By sunrise, we had every piece of documentation in the hands of lawyers, investigators, and reporters. The media ate it up. Headlines. Wife of the Year. Woman caught with 3 husbands in 3 states. Suburban bigamist exposed. How one woman managed 3 marriages for a decade. Dorothy's entire world collapsed overnight. Bank accounts? Frozen. Jobs? Terminated. Public reputation? Destroyed. And the best part? She had no way out. Bigamy is a felony, and 2 out of 3 states actually took serious interest in pressing charges. By the time the legal system was done with her, she was facing divorce lawsuits, fraud allegations, and potential jail time. Her life was officially over. And mine? Better than ever. Herbert and I? We toasted over drinks. Matthew, husband number 3, joined us via video call. 3 men, 3 broken marriages, 1 ruined woman, and 0 regrets. The last time I saw Dorothy, she was sitting in a lawyer's office, completely destroyed. No money, no homes, no husbands, just a pile of lawsuits and a lifetime of consequences. I smiled, because for once, Dorothy was exactly where she deserved to be. And me? I walked out that door and never looked back. Because revenge is temporary. But her downfall? That was permanent. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel